Today's scripture reading is taken from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. It's in page 843 in the Pew Bible. And if you found that, could you please stand with me? Second Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8 says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated.
All right. So I know that it's a little bit warm. If you need to at some point stand and get outside or get in front of the fan, don't hog the fan for everybody. But that's okay. I won't be too offended. Just pick the right parts of the sermon. I don't want to get the wrong idea of what's going on. Anyway. Let's spend just a bit more time in prayer and lift up this time to the Lord. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that your Spirit lifted people to write it, that it is a miraculous composition of man and God, and the divine nature of the Spirit of the Scriptures makes it true, and it makes it timeless, so that we can look at this 2,000 years roughly after it was written and still come away with an inspiration, and still come away looking at you and worshiping you. And we pray that in our time together that is your word that speaks, and it is your Spirit that speaks, and that we hear and that we listen and that we obey. You guys might know he's not here today, but my second son, his name is Elliot. He's named after Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot was a missionary, an American missionary to Ecuador, and he was killed on the beaches of the Wanai River, along with 4 other missionaries. They were killed by the Wyodoni tribe that they were trying to reach. They were trying to make contact with, so that they could share the gospel with him. And Elliot's death, plunged him into the national spotlight, and it in its essence made him famous. But it isn't his death that really attracted me to Jim Elliot and led me to name my son after him. It was his life. His death was just a natural outworking of his life. It was completely natural that Jim Elliot would die for his faith, because his whole life was there. He lived his life as a poured out life in front of God. Through every circumstance, in terms of relationship, in terms of, he had a period of waiting, wondering what God was calling him to, and all of that was lived in a poured out way. He lived as if every breath that he had was given to him by God, and it was. And I'm sure if he was here, he would be saying I'm speaking too much, and maybe that's true, but his life has inspired me to live poured out. And here in our passage this morning, Paul is talking about living a poured out life. He's saying, let's look at it. He says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure." What's Paul talking about? This image of being poured out like a drink offering would be something that is very familiar to Paul, and it's very familiar to Timothy. It was part of the sacrificial system where you would take a liter of wine, and remember, Paul's writing from Rome, so this is nice Italian wine, right? Okay, maybe that's overstating the text a little bit, but they would take this wine, and they would just slowly pour this liter of wine over the sacrifice on the altar. And Paul's using this as a picture for his life. He's saying, I'm poured out. And notice here, it's not Paul doing the pouring. He says, I am being poured out. This is a passive sense. I'm being poured out like this wine over the altar. What resistance does liquid have in the pull of gravity? None. And that's what Paul is saying. This is how I've lived my life, Timothy. And throughout this letter, this is how Paul's been asking Timothy to live his life. And so here, near the conclusion of this last letter of Paul, he's going to give Timothy two places to look, two reasons, two encouragements to live that poured out life, to live a life poured out in service, in honor, and in worship of God. 2 ways to be poured out, 2 places to look. Now, before we get to Paul's points, I think there's an obvious objection that probably most of us need to have answered first. Why? Why live poured out? Why was Paul being poured out? And especially when Paul came to the end of his life and he realized how it was going to end, why would he encourage Timothy to do the same? And why would, through them, why would we be encouraged to live poured out? What a waste. What good does wine do being poured out like that? What good does our lives do being poured out like that? What comes from that? If there's anything that our culture really values, and let's not kid ourselves, we're the same, it's freedom and significance, right? Do you value those things, your freedom and your significance? I want to be free to make my own choices. I want to have freedom. I want to get out of my parents' house. I want to make my own choices. I don't want the government to tell me what I can and cannot do. I want to have freedom, and I want to make those choices in a way that leads to significance. And that significance can look all sorts of ways. We can look for fame, and we can look for glory. We can also look for, I want to help people. We're kidding ourselves that we're not seeking significance because it's through someone else, but we're looking for significance. Well, what freedom does water have? Does wine have when it's poured out? What significance does it have when it's poured out to life? Why would Paul live like that? Why would Timothy live like that? And why would we be called to live like that? If we look at our culture, we do actually value a poured out life. And we value it in our movies. Well, at least in our chick flicks, right? Now maybe you've seen this movie. See if you can guess what movie I'm talking about. The one where the man falls in love with the woman, and she completely captures his heart. But then tragedy strikes, and she has a debilitating illness, and now she has nothing to offer him. And although he could just walk away from her because of his great love for her, he pours out his life to her, and motivated by love and motivated by compassion. And even though she can't do anything for him and gives nothing in return, he continues to love her and takes care from her. You know what movie I'm talking about? The Notebook, right? Or is it The Vow? Or A Walk to Remember? Or 50 First Dates? Or sometimes that illness is fate, or it's another man, and then it's Dear John, or The Lucky One, or The Adjustment Bureau, or The English Patient, or Serendipity. And, it's warm, so we should just end that list. But we value that idea of being poured out. But it isn't just these idealized, over-romanticized movies that value this. On this stage, many couples have pledged their love and their life to each other. And a lot of those vows, they included something about pouring out their lives to each other. And rightly, we value those vows. And we look in admiration to the people who not only say them, but live those out, and they pour out their life to their spouse. Or we celebrate young men who pour out their lives for their countries. At the beginning of June, a lot of us turned our eyes to the beaches of France where European and world leaders and veterans gathered to remember and to honor the roughly 10,000 Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy and poured out their blood and their lives on those beaches for their country and for their way of life. And we rightly respect and are thankful for these sacrifices. But you might say, but the God I believe in doesn't ask for such a waste. He's a God of love. He doesn't want us to waste our life like that. We're glad and we're thankful for people who've poured out their lives like that, but we mourn that they had to. God would never ask us to do that. My God doesn't ask that I pour out my life like that. Well, let's look at it this way. I believe that God deserves praise and glory. I think that's what the scriptures say, that God deserves praise and glory. He deserves all of our life. And when I say something like that, we often bristle at that word deserves, don't we? We say, yeah, well, God deserves it. But he wouldn't actually cash that check. Those of you who are Seahawks fans. Yeah, Marshawn Lynch maybe deserves a pay raise, but he shouldn't have held out like that. He shouldn't have been so full of himself. God's not like that. He deserves it, but he'll never cash it. He deserves it, but he doesn't require we actually give it to him. Let's think of this word deserve in another sense. Tim Keller talks about how beauty deserves admiring. Beauty deserves being noticed. It deserves being enjoyed. If we get a sunny fall, I challenge you, if we get a sunny fall where the mountains have, the North Shore Mountains have fresh snow and they sparkle in the sunlight and they're up against the backdrop of that rich blue sky, and you walk out of this building right here and you look across the water, I challenge you to look at that scene and not, at least inside, go, wow. Or a couple days ago from my house, I saw that the sky was turning color. The sun was setting, and it was oranges and reds, and it was just beautiful. So I got on my rollerblades and went as fast as I could to the rose garden just down the road from where I am, where I could see better. And then that wasn't even good enough. I went down towards the road to get a view of this sunset. And the sun was just over top of the mountains. I guess that would have been Sunshine Coast, and the sky was filled with oranges and reds, and it was catching the clouds, and it was shimmering on the water. And I just had to get out where I could see it. I just had to, because that beauty deserved me to look at it, deserved me to take it in, deserved me to look. Now, I could tell a joke, and you'd laugh just because I'm here. The joke probably, if it's me, it wouldn't be funny, but you'd laugh anyway, see? Just like Glenn did, because of the external pressure from me to laugh at my joke. Just remember that. There's an external pressure to laugh at my jokes. But if a comedian told a joke, we would laugh instinctively, intrinsically, because of the intrinsic humor in the joke, okay? Nobody does that wheezing laugh on purpose. No one snorts on purpose. They don't do it intentionally. They do it because the joke demands that they laugh, and they can't stop it. They have to laugh or they have to clap. They look like a fool, but they just have to do it because the humor in that joke demands that they laugh. Or think, I was reading last week the fairy tale of the Emperor's New Clothes. And if you're not familiar with that, I thought I was, but then reading the story realized I wasn't really familiar with it. There's these con artists, and they convince the king and then the entire empire that they have weaved this fine cloth and this fine material to make rich robes for the emperor. But the thing is that unless you're wise or you're competent, you can't see it. Only the wise and the competent can see these robes. So the king, he puts on these robes, which aren't actually there, they're imaginary, and he parades around in front of his empire, and everybody goes, oh, beautiful clothes. They're not admiring the clothes, there's nothing there. They are compelled, A, by the desire not to look like a fool, and B, the desire not to rise the ire of the emperor. They're compelled to admire the clothing that isn't there. But if a bride comes out in her bridal gown, all done up nice, and the whole audience turns and their collective breath is taken away, it isn't because of anything other than the intrinsic beauty of the bride and her dress that takes it away. And that's the sense that Jesus deserves to be served. That's the sense that God demands and deserves to be worshipped. It's his intrinsic goodness, it's his intrinsic beauty that takes us and demands us to pour out our lives to him. It isn't an external force because God is judge, although that plays in a bit, but it's more his internal goodness, his holiness, and his beauty that as we see him as he truly is, we can do nothing but pour out our lives in obedience to him. Okay, so back to our text. Paul is urging us, and he's urging Timothy to pour out our lives in reverence, in worship, and obedience to God. And he gives us two ways, two encouragements, two places to look for strength and inspiration. The first one is we can be encouraged to pour out our lives to God by looking to others. Okay, when we look to others pouring out their lives to God, it awakes us to the vision of God's beauty once again. Natasha is constantly amazed by God's beauty in creation. I don't know if I would have used that mountain example if it wasn't for her influence on my life, but she's constantly amazed by the intricacy and the beauty and the grandeur of creation. And when I see her eyes light up at these sights, or I see her bend down to examine the intricacy of a ladybug on a buttercup in a field, I suddenly see it too. It reawakens my eyes to see God's beauty in these things. It's the same when I read Jim Elliot's diaries of his desire to serve Christ and how bitter the taste of a wasted breath or a wasted life was in his mouth, how much he worked to avoid that because it tasted bitter to not pour out his life to God. And it awakens in me a desire to serve Christ and to pour out my life to him. Look again at verse 6. Paul says, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering." That the word "I" there, "for I," Paul does the kind of the Greek equivalent of putting it in bold, underlining it, circling it, and highlighting it. Okay, Greek has ways to emphasize words, and Paul pulls them all out, and he emphasizes "I" as much as possible. The point of that first phrase is, "Look at me. I have done this. I am doing this. Look at me, Timothy." Not in a vain sense, not in a "look at me how great I am" sense, but in a "be encouraged by me, Timothy. Look at me as I follow Christ. Look at me as I do this. Be encouraged by my life." Let's keep reading verse 7. "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." If you've been with us throughout this whole sermon series in 2 Timothy, you'll recognize some of these images. They're images that Paul has already used to encourage Timothy. He's told him, "Timothy, fight the fight. Timothy, run the race. Timothy, keep the faith." And now near the end of his letter, he's saying, "Because I have. Look to me. Look how I have done that. I've done what I've told you to do. You can do it. You can do it. Look to me." Again, not because Paul is proud or vain. Remember, this is the man who also went around calling himself the chief of sinners. But because Paul knew that Timothy would need some encouragement and he would need to see someone actually walk that walk. He says, "Look to me. Look how I have done it. Remember." And Timothy hasn't watched Paul from a distance. Timothy has walked with him. And he's been there and he's seen the beatings, he's seen the stonings, he's seen the difficulty, he's seen the hard hearts. He knows what that walk looks like. And Paul's saying, "Now look to me as you pour out your life, because you'll face these difficulties. Look to me." So how do we... Actually, first of all, I want us to look at Hebrews 12, verse 1. At the end of her biography of her husband, Elizabeth Elliot puts Jim Elliot and those he died with in amongst the numerous people listed in Hebrews chapter 11. If you're not familiar with Hebrews 11, it's a chapter about faith, and it goes on to list what we call the Hall of Faith. And these are people, some of them are biblical characters, some of them are extra biblical characters, but people who have lived a life poured out, lived a life of faith, lived a life poured out in obedience to God. And so Elizabeth puts her husband in amongst those people, and she makes the point that Hebrews 12, verse 1 makes. It says, "Therefore, because we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses, all these faithful people, all these people who have poured out their lives, because we're surrounded by them, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." Let's look to others who have poured out their lives, and because of that, we can pour out our lives, and we can see how they've done it, and we can follow their example. So we've already talked in our time together through some of the other sermons about looking to others and using some of the narratives in Scripture, or using Christian biographies. And I'd recommend those, but I want to spend our time somewhere else. I want to tell us this morning that to look to others, we should look to Christian community. Okay, there's a reason that when we come to Christ, he brings us to his bride, the church. There's no solo Christians. We're brought into the community of the church, Jesus' congregation. There's a reason the New Testament assumes that Christians are committed to a local body, a visible body of Christian community. Because we serve as an example, albeit an imperfect example, but we serve as an example to encourage others to be a poured out life. So look around this church, and you'll see examples of people who are being poured out, who are living lives poured out. Again, not perfectly, but in their circumstances and in their life, they're living poured out. Okay, I haven't talked to any of these people, so I'm sorry if I embarrass you, but we have Don who attempts to pour out his life in a business world that's characterized often by greed and self-centeredness, and he's trying to pour out his life in that. Or Frank, he's not here this morning, but we see him pouring out his life in the midst of losing his lifelong partner in Janet and in his current situation. And we see Glenn and his daily battle with sickness, and he's trying to pour out his life. Or we see Grace, who poured out her life when she came to know Christ in a foreign country, and none of her family knew the God that she loved and worshiped. And she poured out her life, and now they do. We have parents who are walking very long and very hard roads with children. We have men and women who are pouring out their lives in the midst of depression. And it's not easy because of what their mind does to them, but they still seek to pour out their lives. Look around you. I know none of us pour out our lives perfectly, and we don't want to be the example that everyone follows because we see our faults, and that's right. But still look around and see how we do pour out our lives, how those around us pour out our lives in the midst of trouble, in the midst of illness, sometimes in the midst of prosperity, and in the midst of wealth, two things which can easily hide our dependence and our desire to follow God. But don't only look to Christian community, be involved in deeper Christian community. When we gather here on Sunday mornings, this here is not church, okay? What we're doing right now is not church, because you can't do church. We often call it church, and I'm sorry, I often call it church, but what this really is a gathering of the church, because the church is a people. It's not a worship service. The people of God, the church, does have worship services, but it is not in itself an event. It's a people. So this Sunday morning gathering, this is for a particular purpose. It's for teaching. It's for corporate worship. It's for spending time together and praising God together through singing, through praying, through listening to the word taught, through taking communion together. But what Sunday morning is not awesome at is building community and letting us see each other's lives. Okay, we try. We have coffee time, and we chat, and some community building happens, and we do see some people's lives, and we do get into each other's lives a little bit. But Sunday morning is a lot like Facebook when it comes to community, okay? Our Sunday morning news feed is filled up by posts with serial posters, okay? So it's usually Barton or today myself. You know, we get a lot of, this is posts from Kyle on Facebook. This is what Kyle is thinking. This is, what's going on in Kyle's life, and he's sharing examples of his life that are way too detailed for being up on stage. But anyway, he's overshared, so whatever. That's our Facebook wall is filled up with these posts, and maybe a few other posts or personal messages from other people. But a lot of us are just Facebook lurkers on Sunday morning. A lurker is someone who reads the posts, they enjoy them, but they don't interact. They don't share their own posts. Okay, it's what most of us do on Sunday morning. Or some of us are on Facebook using a pseudonym. We can't help it, but all of who we are doesn't come with us to Sunday morning. Okay, this is not good. This is understandable. It's reality. It's not necessarily good. But this is why we need to have more involvement with the church. I don't mean more time. I mean that we need to spend more time with other Christians. This is why at DHBC we have opportunities for deeper involvement in the body of Christ. We have home groups and grow pods, which will start again in the fall. And these are places where you can get to know each other. This is places where you can be who you really are, and you can see other people's lives as they actually are, and encourage others to look at your lives. And you can say, look to me as I follow Christ. And you can look to others as they follow Christ. And they can be an example for you to pour out your life. So we need to be involved in deeper community. I have so many conversations with people who say, nobody knows what I'm going through. I wish I could talk to somebody about this, but nobody would understand. And a lot of times I look at them and I said, yeah, there are people going through exactly the same thing. They're sitting 2 rows behind you on Sunday, but you don't know them because you only see them on Sunday morning. You're not involved in deeper community. So they can't be an encouragement to you to pour out your life in this circumstance because you have no idea what's going on with them. You need to pour into deeper community. And I know some of us have situations in our lives where joining a home group or a pod is impossible. We need to do some things to get to know other Christians and to spend our lives together and to see how others pour out their lives to Christ. But Paul doesn't just encourage Timothy to look at him, doesn't just encourage Timothy to look at others, but we can be encouraged to pour out our lives to God by looking to the future. I just need a drink, and then we'll read verse 8. This is what Paul says. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day, and not only to me, but to all who have longed for his appearing. Now, what Paul's doing here is he's saying something that's both future and current. He's saying now there is in store. He's talking about his departure, and in the future he will go there, but it's already there waiting for him. It's waiting for him. It's something that's he'll get fully in the future, but it's already sitting there and waiting. Okay, there's something in the future for me, but it's already guaranteed. Another way to look at this is Paul spoke about his death in verse 6. He had said, "For I'm already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure." So he's speaking of his death, and the word he uses is of a ship raising its anchor and setting sail. Okay, and Timothy has seen this exact scene pour out in Paul's life so many times, where Paul had been visiting him, and then he caught a ship to the next place to go, and Timothy has seen this departure, and Paul's saying, there's coming another departure just kind of like that, where I'm gonna take up anchor from here, and I'm gonna sail on, and waiting for me when I finally make that journey is something. It's a reward. So he goes on to describe this reward. He talks about the reward, the crown of righteousness, and he talks about the giver of the reward, the righteous judge. So we can look to this reward. A friend of mine on Facebook, since we were talking about Facebook and everything, posted on Facebook this quote that I guess it's from a TV show called True Detectives. I haven't seen it, but one of the characters is played by Matthew McConaughey. In the show, the character was just told how religion is necessary to keep people from being liars and thieves and basically being jerks and bad people. And in the show, Matthew McConaughey replies, and this is the quote that my friend put on Facebook. He says, if the only thing keeping a man decent is the promise of a divine reward, then brother, that person is a piece of work. Okay, I've changed the words a little bit. If you've watched the show, I edited a bit to fit this context so I don't get fired. But basically, what the character is saying is that this doctrine of heaven is just really bad parenting. Okay, it's basically equivalent to promising your child a nice cream bar if they stop throwing a fit in the supermarket. It's just really bad parenting where the reward has nothing to do with the behavior. It's an external reward that has nothing to do with the behavior. So God is saying, act like I want you now, and then there'll be a reward in the future. The only thing keeping a man decent is the promise of divine reward. Then he's really not a very good person. He's a bad person. Well, is this what Paul is talking about? Is he saying that I've behaved this way so I get a reward in the future that's totally unrelated to the way I behaved? Well, let's look at it again. Okay, don't actually look. This is probably the only time where I will I'll tell you to not look at your Bibles, but I want to see what you can do from memory. We just read this verse. I'm going to start it off. I want you to finish it, okay? Now there is in store for me, what? Okay, say it louder again. I heard a crown of righteousness. Okay, let's do this again. Okay, I'm going to do it again, and then all together, as loud as you can, say what you think the verse ends with. There is stored up for me. Oh, you did it. The crown. That's right. I thought, I must admit, I underestimated you. I thought you guys were going to say a crown of righteousness, but it isn't a crown of righteousness. The picture is not that Paul goes to heaven and there's a whole bunch of crowns there, and he sort of shows his lanyard and says, see, I get in, and then picks up a crown and goes off. No, the picture is that there is one crown, and it's not just a regular crown. This is the crown of righteousness, meaning that righteousness is what the crown is. The reward is righteousness. And a crown, Paul talked about this picture of running the race. A crown in Greco-Roman culture was what you got when you finished the race, when you were victorious of the race. You didn't get a medal, you got a crown. So this reward is not completely external and completely different from what Paul has been living. What it is it's the fulfillment of what he was seeking after and what he was running for. It is showing that he finished that race. He goes to heaven and he gets the crown of righteousness. Where he sought to be righteous, where he sought to live righteous, he gets the righteousness. That's what he's talking about. This isn't talking about riches. This isn't talking about a good life. This isn't talking about going to heaven and not having any worries. This is talking about I'm living this way. I'm pouring out my life because I will receive this righteousness, this crown, the crown of righteousness. Now, some of you are going, well, that's great for Paul. a first century Jew who lived by the law, and righteousness was a big deal to him. Righteousness, not a really big deal to me. Like, that's sort of an old concept. Our culture doesn't really care about righteousness nowadays. Really? What does the word righteousness mean? What does the word righteousness mean? To be righteous means to meet a standard. It means to be accepted. Okay? The word righteousness, both the Hebrew and the Greek words, are built on this concept of fulfilling a standard. Think of an acceptance letter that you get from a college. You have to submit all your grade reports, submit your scores, and then you have to write essays, and you do all of the interviews in the hopes of getting into the program. And you get the letter back from the institution, and you don't know whether you should open it because you don't want to get the bad news. And you open it, and what does it say? You have been accepted. That's righteousness. You have met the standard. You have been accepted. Earlier, I said that there's two things our culture values above all else: freedom and significance. I lied. Acceptance motivates our culture. Righteousness. We don't know it. We don't realize it. But righteousness motivates what we do. But we're not looking for acceptance from God. We're looking at acceptance from other people. But why wouldn't we seek acceptance? Why wouldn't we seek meeting the standard of the Creator, of the true one, of the only one that can, whose acceptance, whose giving of righteousness never fails, never ends. Any other way that you seek acceptance, that'll end on that journey. That'll end on that departure. But Paul said, I'm running this race because I know that I am seeking the acceptance, the righteousness that never fades away. When I go to heaven, when I move on from here, I will have the acceptance of God fully and completely placed on my head. And that's why he pours out his life. And there's this message that you've been approved. You are righteous. You are accepted. But then the question is, how does Paul know that he will get the crown? How can he be certain of getting God's approval? He knows he isn't. He knows he won't. So the interesting thing about this passage is that Paul knows that when he departs, he won't get God's approval. What does he say? That's why he points not just to the reward, but to the giver of the reward. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. The Lord, the righteous judge, will give it to me. It's not mine. The crown of righteousness does not belong to me. It belongs to the Lord, the righteous judge. Look at how this is Jesus he's talking about. Look how he talks about him. He embodies righteousness in the person of Jesus. And that's what the scriptures say, that Jesus was the perfect righteous one, that he met God's standard perfectly. He was exactly what humanity was designed to be. He met the standards of what humanity was supposed to be perfectly. And he is righteousness. In fact, he is the judge of what is righteous or not, meaning that if Jesus is something, that something is righteousness. If Jesus is not something, that something is not righteousness. He is the very standard. He embodies the standard of what righteousness is. He embodies the standard of acceptance. And that Lord, the righteous judge, Paul says, will give me the crown. I saw one of you grimace when I read Hebrews 12, verse 1, and stopped there. Let's go to Hebrews 12, verse 2. I'm going to read verse 1 again. I think just verse 2 will be on the screen. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. And that, what does that run do? Verse 2, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. I would spend so much time explaining this verse, but I'm going to have to leave a bunch of it aside because it's warm and you guys are sweating and you don't have water beside you. But what is this? It says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. What motivated Jesus to pour out his life and to go to the cross? What was that joy? Was it to sit down at the right hand of God? Well, that'd be pretty silly because he got up from the right hand of God and came down to earth. So why would he go through all of that just to get back to where he already was, what was rightfully his? Was it to gain that crown of righteousness? No, he was already the righteous judge and had the crown of righteousness before he ever came to earth. So what was the joy that motivated Jesus to go to the cross? Taking off his crown of righteousness and giving it to Paul and giving it to us. Jesus was motivated to pour out his life to make us who are not righteous, righteous, not because of what we have done, but because of what he did. And he was looking forward to take off that crown and to put it on our heads. He was looking to take off that crown and put it on Paul's head. And that's what Paul said motivated him to pour out his life. Why? To be good enough? To gain that righteousness? No. That was what Paul did for the first half of his life. And then he met Jesus on the Damascus Road and realized that he would never be good enough. He could never meet God's standard. And the only thing that he could do was to accept that Jesus had poured out his life for him. And that made Paul say, I have to. It demands, I absolutely have to pour out my life for Jesus because Jesus, who was everything, poured out his life for me, who is nothing. Struggle to pour out my life? No, when I look at this, I can't help but do it. I snort laughter at it. If you remember our introduction, if not, that makes no sense to you. But when I look at what Jesus, when I look forward to that crown of righteousness, when I look forward to that righteous judge who does not deserve, does not need to take off that crown, taking it off to give it to me because he poured out his life for me, I can't help but pour out my life for him. I can't help it. It demands it. Jesus' life demands that I pour out my life for him because I can think of nothing else. How can I not? How can I not, Timothy? How can I not, Dunbar Heights? How can you not pour out your life? It's just impossible. So here we have the gospel. The gospel which says we're not righteous, we don't deserve that crown. But through what Jesus has done, he will give it to us. He will apply it to us because of what he has done and not what we have done. So what does this mean? Downtown, right now, there's a whole bunch of people gathering to watch a parade. Okay, it's a pride parade. Everyone's like, well, okay, what's going on? What's he going to do with this? I want us to think of that. Why do you think it's called pride? I didn't look into it, but this is what I think this is how it came to be. Did you know the name Christian it was applied by enemies of Jesus. It was applied by people who hated Christians. It was originally like it was a slur. Oh, Christian, I mean, all those little Christs. Okay? One of the names that the LGBTQ community applies to themselves is queer. And that was originally, that was a slur. Queer meaning different. Queer meaning you're broken. Queer meaning you don't follow what you're supposed to. And you know what? That applies to all of us. That's what Paul found out on the Damascus Road. That he was broken, that he did not follow, despite his efforts, he did not follow what he was supposed to be. He did not meet God's standard. And when you realize that, there's two things you can do. You can do what Paul used to do, which was, oh no, that's not true. Look over here. Look at my righteous deeds. I'm not apart. I'm not different. I'm not wanting. I'm good. I'm righteous. I'm fine. Or the other thing you can do is to be proud of it. You can say, I'm different, I'm wrong, and I love it. And where the church in North America has largely failed is we say, darn right, you're different. Darn right, you're wrong. When we need to realize that we are all broken. We all don't meet that standard of righteousness. But Jesus poured out his life for anybody who will accept his life. That Jesus poured out his life for anyone who will realize that they are broken and they will say, I embrace this, I believe it's true, I know it's true, I'm not going to try and hide it from good deeds, but nor am I going to be proud of it. Instead, I'm going to be broken, I'm going to live my life poured out for you, just like you poured out your life for me. The gospel says you're broken, but I will heal you. You have just rags, but I will take off my crown of righteousness and I will put it on your head. You are a worm, but I will pour out my life for you. So one more thing in this passage I'll just touch on briefly, and then we'll close. And it's not on the slide, but it's the circumstances that we receive this crown. So Paul says, "Now there is in store for me this crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day." And he says, "And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." This word "longed," it really means love. But Paul is writing from the time period of when Christ has returned, and so he's looking back, and so he's saying that you've longed for it, and longed for the day of his appearing. And what exactly is it that what does that mean? What I would have thought, if I wrote this, I would have said, not only to me, but also to all those who love Jesus, or who try to be righteous, or something like that. But Paul says, not only to me, but all those who have longed for his appearing. What is he talking about? He's talking about those who long to be united with Jesus, because when Jesus returns, we'll have what he called the marriage supper of the Lamb. The marriage supper of the Lamb. You see, because when we come to Jesus, Paul writes that we unite ourselves with him. And he uses the picture of a marriage. Just like a husband and a wife come together and they come to form one. So that is, when we come to Jesus, that we come and we become identified with him. And the scriptures call the church the bride of Christ, and says that in the end of time, when Jesus comes back to judge the world, that he will have this marriage supper of the Lamb. And we will be united with Christ, and that marriage will be sealed. And that's our desire, to live united with Christ, and that comes to a fulfillment when that time comes. So think, those of you who are married, think, some of you it's way far back, some of you it's not so far back. Think of awaiting your marriage. You weren't waiting for the presents. You weren't waiting to have a ring on your finger. You were waiting to be united with the one that you love. And that's what Paul is saying. Jesus will give his crown of righteousness to all who love him and are just waiting to be united with the one that they love. And that means that here and now, we're acting as if we want to be united with the one we love. So we don't act completely separate from Jesus, and then when the wedding comes, be like, okay, now here I am. You don't the week before the wedding, you don't go sleeping around with everybody else and get it all out of your system because you want to spend the rest of your life with this one person. No, when you're waiting and longing for a marriage, when you're waiting and you're longing for a marriage, you just long to be with that person. And so you live poured out for them. And you're waiting for the day when that's finally celebrated. And we mirror that celebration in communion.